Good evening, friends of Dar, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah. It's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest for today's lecture, Dr. Marcus Pilz. Dr. Pilz is a scholar and a creator specializing in arms and armors, coins and medals, and currently works at Kansmling Dervis Cooper Museum, which is an art museum. Dr. Pilz studies in art history, German philology, and theology at Maximilian University in München, completing a groundbreaking thesis on medieval Islamic rock crystal objects. He has held prestige roles, including a fellowship in the Mediterranean Museum of Arts. He has published a different topic, including culture, artist exchange between Europe and Islamic history. Most of the history on Ottoman objects and Western collection, as well as on European decorative arts and arms, from Middle Ages to the early modern period. Today, Dr. Pilz will guide us into the fascinating world of rock crystal fossils, exploring their art history, technical challenge, and historical significance. His lecture will highlight these masterpieces' roles in Abbasids and Fatimids, luxury and global trade. He gave me a secret that he was himself as a craftsman before he started into academia. So that's why it's explaining why he's into the details of these masterpieces, especially the technique challenge that he studied. Please join me and warmly welcoming Dr. Pilz on the stage.
Good evening, and thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak here tonight. And I would also like to extend my thanks to the team that organized all this and made it possible and made my stay here so comfortable. Tonight, I would like to take you on a journey of fascinating objects. Already, this detail gives you an idea about the quality, the outstanding technical achievement the rock crystal objects in the Abbasid and Fatimid period were. And it's a topic that is quite close to my heart. I started my PhD thesis in 2012, and even though I'm in the meantime in a museum where we have no rock crystals at all, this is still something I'm very much involved in, and I'm still working on this. And I hope with this talk to be able to pass on a glimpse of this fascination also to you. The ones of you who heard about these objects before might be surprised to read about rock crystal carvings for the Abbasid and Fatimid courts, because since more than 100 years, the story of Islamic rock crystal carving is mostly labeled as Fatimid. This is the piece that is in large parts responsible for that. A wonderful ewer which bears the name of the Fatimid Caliph al-Aziz, reigning from 975 to 996. And as this was the first known object with an attribution, and there was, of course, the famous report by al-Makrizi about the looting of the Fatimid treasures with the mentioning of thousands of rock crystal objects, scholars for a very long time assumed that all the rock crystal carvings must have been made in Fatimid Egypt, and that this, in a way, was the starting piece of this whole story, of this technical tradition. But by saying so, a lot of the scholars for a long time ignored written sources, I will come to this a little later, but also the technical hints within the object itself. Because if you look to the details, you can easily see that this object is not a first attempt. it is actually the peak of a very long development and is an object so complex like hardly any other in this group of objects. First of all, I would point your attention to the image in the middle. You can see there in the top, where the inscription is, a relief depth of about 1 millimeter. If you look here, it is about 3 millimeters. And in that section down here, you can see it better here, it's about 5 millimeters, which means the depth of the relief is varying, which is an absolutely unique thing. And why is this so astonishing? It is so astonishing because these objects, the walls of these objects, are extremely thin. What I show you here is a fragment of another ewer that was heavily damaged in an accident, so we have this image. And it gives you an idea how these objects were actually made. So the craftsman first made a vessel, polished it, and in a second step, a carver engraved the decoration on it. And you can see the engraver carved away almost half of the thickness of the wall. So the remaining part of the wall of this vessel is less than 2 millimeters. It is like a modern drinking glass. It's quite astonishing if you think that this was carved out of a solid block of stone. So the craftsman who did the ornament cut, he must have been able to trust his colleague who made the raw object that the thickness of the wall is completely uniform, because otherwise there would be a great risk that he would break through at one point. And now imagine this with a change of relief depth. So it is a co-working of several masters, everyone an absolute master on his field, and that was needed to create something like this. So this object is the absolute masterpiece of that group. And now we jump from Cairo to Germany, to Aachen. The object you can see here was made in the first decade of the 11th century. It is a pulpit in the church, in the cathedral in Aachen, the church in which the German kings of the medieval period were crowned. And that is the significance that brought about this amazing object. It is like a jewel box. If you look at it, it's covered with amazing objects, mostly late antique or from Byzantium. You have gorgeous late antique ivories here. You have Byzantine agate bowls here. Originally, you had a Roman cameo in the center. And you also have 2 Islamic objects included in this piece. You can see them here taken off for an exhibition 2 years ago, and that gave us the unique opportunity to take a closer look on these objects. They are mounted like jewels, so what you can see is actually the bottom of the object with the engraving. They were totally detached from their original use, and here they are purely decorative, or they send a message. And the message is that these objects are in line with the antique imperial tradition of stone carving, if you think about the original cameo there in the center. The German kings were not aware that these objects were made in the Islamic world, most probably, because they arrived with all the other treasures of this object from Byzantium. Most probably in context of a wedding, the wedding of a German prince with a Byzantine princess in 972. Otto II and the Princess Theophanu married in that year, forming an alliance between the Western and the Eastern emperors. Ahead of this wedding were long negotiations with exchanges of gifts, and we can assume that most of these objects were from this gift exchange. And just to give you some context about the idea that these were Fatimid objects, the wedding of Theophanu and Otto took place in April of 972, almost 2 months before the Fatimid Caliph al-Mu'izz moved into his newly founded capital, Cairo. So Cairo was not even installed as a caliphal residence when these objects were sent to Germany. So here we have another hint to the earlier dating of this, and at this point I should also mention one problem we have with the rock crystal objects. We have absolutely no archaeological evidence about their production and of their dating. So rock crystal object was ever found in a documented excavation anywhere in the Islamic world. There's only one piece some years ago which was found in a shipwreck in Indonesia, which can now be seen in Doha in the museum. But otherwise we are totally in the dark. Archaeology doesn't help us here. And then we have the sources. And there are plenty of sources that speak about the use of rock crystal vessels at the Abbasid court from different sources, different authors, and it might be no coincidence that the earliest sources are related to the mid-9th century, a period where Abbasid culture was very much on the peak. But we have to think about the establishment of Abbasid hardstone workshops in relation to the rivalry between the courts of the Abbasid caliphs and the emperors of Constantinople. In Constantinople, hardstone carving was still very much alive since antiquity. You can see on the left a bowl, which is today preserved in San Marco, carved of agate. And here, that might be actually one of the earliest examples of Islamic hardstone carving. A bowl also carved in agate, and it shows a very particular pattern, a row of lancet leaves connected by these little roundels. It's also called the Samarra frieze, a typical decorative pattern you can find in Samarra, but also in other Abbasid architecture and art. And all this points to Samarra, to this unbelievable caliphal residence, which was built in a quite short time. Samarra, in its incredible extent, if you look to the map and the measurements there, Samarra was for sure the most remarkable testimony of the stunning cultural and economical power of the Abbasid Empire in the 9th century. Founded in 936, it flourished under the rule of the 10th Abbasid Caliph, al-Mutawakkil, before being widely abandoned in 892. So it seems not that much of a surprise that hardstone carving is first mentioned here, in an empire that was able, within a very short span of time, to create something like this amazing city from scratch. Still today, we can see the wonderful minaret there. And it is from the rule of al-Mutawakkil that we have this mentioning of the use of rock crystal bowls to serve food to the caliph. And if we read that they served food in it, we can imagine these were not very small pieces. They must have been of significant size, so that means the tradition reaches back even further. And Samarra, due to its relatively short existence, is of course a wonderful archaeological source, because what we find there can be dated to a very strict time period. And here I show you some of the objects that were excavated there. Not one piece here is made of rock crystal, it's all glass. On the right hand you see a photograph from the first publication of this excavation in the early 20th century. And on the left you can see some of these fragments which are today preserved at the Museum of Islamic Art in Berlin. And if you look in the top row, you can already see the Samarra frieze again. Then you have fragments in the middle with a row of walking animals, and in the bottom, most prominently, floral elements, which we will see later on as the most typical element of Islamic rock crystal carving. And here I show you objects with rather similar patterns or closely related patterns, and those are now the rock crystal objects. On top, again, the agate bowl from the Louvre, but also a wonderful large rock crystal vase in San Marco in Venice. In the center, these animals on the foot of a chalice at the Louvre. And in the bottom, an interesting rock crystal object, we don't even know what it could have been, there are several theories, at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. And there you can see rather similar fan-shaped half palmettes, like in these glass fragments. Of course, the carving is much more precise, much more delicate, because glass was a relatively cheap material in the period compared to rock crystal that was imported from East Africa, and already the raw material was quite precious. I will now go on talking about the floral pattern, as this is the most typical one. And I show you here a row of examples of typical half palmettes, closely related in style, and they even seem to show us a certain stylistic development from rather simple ones to very complex decorated examples here in the lower row. And all these extra cuttings in the decoration, they give the objects this sparkling effect. And now I show you also the objects to these details. Again, our object from the Hermitage, but also two of the ewers, which are always shown as the Fatimid pieces. But here we have, in fact, a very particular design which we can, to which we can group a whole number of objects, and I think this is a quite significant example and a quite significant hint to an own workshop. So these were not just objects where the Fatimid craftsmen said, oh, let's do something different today. You can see here the ewer at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and in the center a fragment at the David collection in Copenhagen. When I was there some years ago, I was able to see this fragment, and I put a scale next to it. And here you can see quite nicely that this fragment is just 1 millimeter thin. So it is even like thin glass. It is an astonishing accomplishment to carve a vessel out of a solid block of stone to a thickness or a thinness of just 1 millimeter. And what you can see here as well is that the relief cut is relatively shallow. And the effect, as I said before, is mainly reached by all these little decorative cuts that nevertheless give it a very sculptural feeling. And if we compare this to the Fatimid pieces, we can see quite clearly that something completely different is going on here. In the Fatimid pieces, we have a very linear design, a rather deep cutting, and in the other pieces, we have these many little decorative cuts and a rather shallow design. So already at this point, we can clearly distinguish not just in design, but also in technique, which is, by my opinion, much more significant if we want to establish the idea of different workshops. And now, what do we actually know about Fatimid rock crystal cutting? And it's not much. We have, compared to the Abbasid period, very little written sources about the production and the use of rock crystal vessels. Often cited is Naziri Khusrau. You can see on the top a Persian traveler who was in Cairo in the mid-11th century, and he saw rock crystal carvings in the Lamp Bazaar in Cairo. But he goes over them rather quickly, and then he explains also that he saw their objects in other precious materials. So I think these were no ewers, that were more smaller objects. And then we have sources which tell us about the presence of rock crystal vessels at the caliphal court without giving us any evidence about the place of production. Because in fact, even al-Makrizi, in his report about the looting of the Fatimid treasury, speaks about several Abbasid objects which were in the Fatimid treasury, a tent of Harun al-Rashid, and most interestingly, several beakers carved out of agate with the name of Harun al-Rashid on it. So another hint for an earlier production in the Abbasid Empire. But we have two objects, and they can indeed give us a good idea about how Fatimid rock crystal carving looked like. You already know the al-Aziz ewer in Venice, and here you see the second piece, a slightly smaller ewer which is today preserved at the Museo degli Argenti in Florence. This is the one who unfortunately broke, so you can still see the cracks in the image. And this vessel could be convincingly attributed, due to its inscription, to Hussein ibn Jawar, the vizier under Caliph al-Hakim. So there we speak about a period approximately 20 years after the al-Aziz ewer, which means these two objects mark a time span, a span for stylistic development of about 20 years, and they are in fact rather close to each other if you look to the design, but also to the technique. And they are something completely different than we have it with the other pieces, with these very shallow and delicate decoration. I'm of course not the first person to realize that something is not working here and that not all these objects look the same. But this is also history of art history. The upper quote is from the catalogue of the exhibition of masterpieces of Islamic art, one of the first large exhibitions that presented Islamic art as art in Munich in 1910. And Ernst Kühnel, one of the big early experts on the field, he wrote the introduction about rock crystal and glass. And there he wrote, we have the al-Aziz ewer, we have the report of al-Makrizi. Why should we think about any other source? So all objects have to be from Fatimid workshops. This went on for about, was published in 1912 for 14 years, because 14 years later, Paul Kahle published the first translation of al-Biruni's chapter on rock crystal. And after Ernst Kühnel read this, he wrote in a letter to Paul Kahle that this is changing everything. Now one would have to review all surviving works, whether according to the type of their decor, they are rather to be localized to Iraq than to Egypt, as previously assumed. Now the whole series needs to be revised. Some of the pieces might be of Fatimid origin, but the others, surely the majority, were made in Abbasid Basra. Unfortunately, this remained a footnote in the literature. Several experts in the second half of the 20th century tried to do this big collection of pieces and the comparison of the pieces, but that never came beyond starting points. So it actually fell to me, and it was a joy at every part of this journey. So here you can see some of the plates from my PhD thesis, and those show you the thin-walled vessels, the famous 7 ewers, but also a whole group of other objects. The majority of these objects must have been made in court workshops, because objects that delicate, as I showed you before, that thin-walled, just imagine first what a miracle it is that these objects survived at all, and then how many of these objects broke until the craftsmen were able to master the trade in that perfection. But this is not the majority of the pieces we have. The majority looks quite different. The majority are these smaller vessels, and what you can see here is just a selection. Already today, I had the pleasure to see some objects of the al-Sabah collection, which are yet unpublished and which could fit wonderfully into these plates. So these are objects that first got their decorative cutting as a massive object, and only at the end a cylindrical drilling was inserted to give them some space. So this is something completely different. And if we think about al-Biruni's source, al-Biruni writes about an almost industrial production in Basra with supply lines going to East Africa, to Asia. So it was really a huge endeavor. And I think these are objects we can point to this production in Basra. And you can see, of course, here also very nicely the variety of shapes and of object types, reaching from rounded and cylindrical bottles to these zoomorphic objects. And if we look to these more simple objects, we discover that they are seemingly strangely unrelated to the courtly production. So neither can we find the typical Fatimid decor, nor the one I would propose as a typical Abbasid decor with these fan-shaped half palmettes. So these more modest, more simple production seems to have followed its own pattern. And in the top row, you can see the characteristic types of half palmettes. Some have these simple, straight, parallel lines. Others are more floral, so more vegetal, where the half palmette is subdivided into little leaves. And that becomes then even slightly more dynamic. And below that, you can see some examples of objects. You can see the cup from the pulpit in Aachen. You can see a small bottle with this linear type of half palmettes. Then we have a small group of objects with a combination of different types of half palmettes. So you can see this for example, also in the center of this beautiful, surprisingly large bottle here at the al-Sabah collection. And then we have this wonderful chess piece, also here in the collection, and it fits perfectly into this Abbasid tradition. And here I totally agree with Deborah Freeman Fahid about the attribution of these pieces to workshops at Basra. All these objects are worth to take a closer look. And sometimes the closer look is only possible if you hold it in your hands. And today I was privileged to see the piece in the center, and I never realized this before, but down here you can see the remnants of another palmet like here. So this piece was much longer. The bottom broke away. Originally it had a tip, and it was most probably pretty much shaped like this piece here, which stands basically upside down. And this is of a rather similar size. It was formerly in the abbey at Quedlinburg, but design-wise as well as of the shape, it's closely related. And it's details like this you can really only see in the originals. And then we have the chessmen, and the chessmen are another group that is often overseen in this discussion on Islamic rock crystal carving, even though these objects are equally interesting. But here, maybe even more than with the other objects, you need a closer look. Because we have pieces like the ones here in the al-Sabah collection, which fit very well to an accomplished stone carving workshop like we expected in the Abbasid Empire. But this object comes from a Spanish church treasury, and from this church treasury are also these two pieces, and they look slightly strange compared to that, because they have a rather rough cut, and it's hard to believe that the workshops who produced something like that piece on the left side would have worked something like the piece in the middle. In fact, Deborah Freeman Fahid attributes this to Eastern Iran, but we could also think about other sources of these objects, for example, Spain, because the wide majority of the about 60 rock crystal chessmen that survive in historical collections are, in fact, in Spain. And then we have an interesting piece like the one on the right. I don't know if you are aware how rock crystal looks like in its natural shape. It's a six-sided prism. If you don't know, you're not alone, because Al-Biruni also had no idea how natural rock crystal looked like, because he saw the rock crystal in the workshops at Basra only in a pre-worked state. So it was not the crystal anymore. It was already a piece of stone, pretty much carved, because you could only use the best quality for the vessels, the one without any inclusions. So they cut away the pieces, the parts with lower quality. And it's quite interesting that Al-Biruni writes on one point in his book on precious stones that he heard from a confidant that at Kashmir, in the mines there, one could find rock crystal that looks like the gaming pieces, how they are used as pawns in the chess game. And here we have, in fact, pieces which look rather close to the natural shape of the rock crystal. So this is actually a piece that Al-Biruni mentions as a product of the workshops of Basra. And I just saw that I'm actually a little ahead of time, so I will go back and will speak a little more about this. Because today we are wondering why rock crystal? Why had rock crystal such an incredible status? It's easy to understand in medieval Europe because the quality of glass production in medieval Europe was rather bad. So rock crystal there was indeed the only perfectly clear material. But in the Islamic world, as we all know, glass production was on a very high level, so they could produce glass that looked like rock crystal. And we even have sources that speak about this close relation between glass and rock crystal. But al-Biruni gives us a hint why rock crystal is something special. Because while glass is a man-made rock crystal is a glass made by God. So it is not a normal material. You dig it up in the ground and it is perfectly clear and clean. It is hard and it has properties that are absolutely unique. It feels always cold, so that is the reason why already in antiquity people believed that rock crystal was actually petrified ice. You can find pieces with inclusions of liquid in it that seem to fit very well in this narrative. And then we have a lot of ideas that rock crystal has healing properties, that it's good for the eyes, because you can use a rock crystal as a magnifying lens. And maybe most important for the early Islamic caliphs, if you drink your wine out of a rock crystal cup, you will never have a headache. Also, this is written down by al-Biruni. I never tried it, but a very well-known scholar once told me, don't laugh about things before you tried it yourself. So I'm still working on that, as I work still very much on these objects. And every single object I see, like today, really brings another puzzle piece to the whole image of this tradition. And with this, I would like to come to an end with the last look on the chessmen. And the new year is actually ahead of us. And I would like to bid you my farewell with the words of a rock crystal, of course. One of the most beautiful pieces, actually, little known. This bottle is in the treasury of San Lorenzo in Florence. And on its shoulder, it shows an inscription. And with this inscription, I would like to wish you and all of us for the coming year eternal glory and joy, grace, fortune, and persistence. And I think we can need this all. Thank you very much for your attention.